Okay, many changes between 1300 to the late 1500s occurred in Europe that's going to have drastic consequences for the system known as feudalism. The first would be Islam's takeover of the Middle East and the church's attempt to take it back. And this was an odyssey known as the Crusades. And second was the financial revolution occurring in towns, especially in Italy, that caused the rise of the guild system for labor and for merchants. And third was the arrival of the bubonic plague. Fourth was the 100 Years' War, and this was a seesaw fight between the French and the British that was fought on French land. And finally, there was the reorganizational movements within the church that eventually helped usher in the Protestant Reformation. So all of these had tremendous impact on the feudal nobility and the power of kings, but they also allowed for increased trade of goods with the Far East. And the most important legacy of the crusading movement was the sanctification or making holy of violence in the pursuit of ideas. Again, let me raise this important legacy. The legacy, okay? This is the sanctification or making holy of violence in the pursuit of ideas. That's the legacy. We live with it to this day. This was not a new concept, but it took on a new force when the Pope and chivalry acted it out in holy wars. In Spain, the Reconquista, the reconquest of the peninsula by Catholic lords over Muslim caliphs, took over 300 years. And in order to unify the country once the Moors were driven out, Isabella and Ferdinand made use of the Inquisition. People were disappeared. People were tortured if they were found guilty of not practicing the Catholic faith. You're either on our side or you're with the enemy. And while the underlying concept of the Crusades outlived its religious origins today, the state, especially this country, the United States, has replaced the church as a holy cause. Now, this is the dangerous legacy. The 100 Years' War of France, despite its terrible cost in lives, property, and money, ultimately raised the power of the French monarch. The war gave rise to feelings of nationalism in both France and England. No longer did people think of the king as simply a feudal lord, but as a national leader fighting for the glory of the country. And most important was the challenge of the church and the movement to change the standards of priests and church leaders. The Protestant Reformation started by challenging the practice of selling indulgences. An indulgence was a pardon which released a sinner from performing the penalty a priest imposed for sins. And this eventually led to Martin Luther's 95 Theses. Then there is the famous split of Henry VIII, him wanting a son, and the issue over annulment. And the rise of a sect founded by John Calvin, who established the doctrine of predestination, a doctrine that, taken to its extreme, will be used to underwrite white supremacy. Now, Jerusalem is a holy city for Judaism and Christianity. And when the region of Palestine fell from Christian control to Islamic rule, Arabs tolerated Jews and Christians in the city. When centralization of power fell to monarchs and their alignment to the church solidified during the Middle Ages, it produced pilgrimages or mass migration of peoples to the Levant or the Holy Lands. And when the travelers returned, they connected isolated Europe with the global civilization of Islam. Visitations were tolerated since Islamic rulers allowed Jews and Christians to practice their faith. However, in the early 7th century, Islamic Seljuk Turks took control of the region and the city, and in an obsessional act, closed Jerusalem to the religious traditions of both Jews and Christians. And when news reached Europe, vengeance in the form of crusades began. And in 1095, the Byzantine emperor wrote Pope Urban II asking for military assistance in the defense of the Holy Land against the Seljuk Turks who had taken the Levant from Byzantium. And in an impassioned speech to a large crowd at Clermont, France, Urban II called for a holy war against Islam, promising penance for the Crusaders. And 3 armies of crusading knights and peasants, numbering close to 100,000, descended on the Holy Land and by 1099 besieged and captured the city of Jerusalem to create a crusader kingdom. Islamic forces by Saladin in 1187 recaptured the city, and other crusades followed. There were 10 crusades in all, and they helped to influence the decline of the Byzantine Empire. Now, there are many debates over the reasons and results of the crusades. They created ill will between Muslims and Christians that linger to this day. They helped increase the authority of kings by speeding up the breakdown of feudalism. They renewed interest in learning. They spurred demand for spices, sugar, and silk. And they helped advance technology, including more accurate maps, magnetic compasses, and improved military techniques. The Crusades spurred interest in products, leading to 3 advances in which increased agricultural production occurred: a heavier plow, a collar harness, and the 3-field system. Increased production led to increased birth rates, which led to revival and growth of towns. And some towns exploded with growth, such as Venice in Italy and Flanders in France. And this in turn led to the development of trade fairs, guilds, banking, and the rise of a merchant and middle class, which fueled the engine of economic growth. Now, it was in towns, not the manor, that people would forge the real future of modern urban Western European culture. And at first, towns were administrative centers serving as residences of bishops and occasionally members of the nobility. Most towns were walled for protection from the surrounding violence of the feudal world. And over time, and increasingly after 1000 of the Common Era, towns turned into commercial cities, developing new ways to govern rising prosperity. Towns offered work in a thriving trade and a lively demand for goods to people who moved in. And during the medieval period, scholars identified close to 3,000 towns in Germany alone, with 2,800 of those towns containing populations of only about 1,000. Europe had few great cities. Cologne was home to 40,000. And by the 1300s, London became home to 40,000. And meanwhile, the Italian cities of Florence and Venice boasted 100,000 residents each. Now, the people residing in these small towns had little in common with feudal society that surrounded them. Oftentimes, towns negotiated charters with the lords on which lands the town stood, thereby escaping the requirements that were imposed on village serfs. Charters granted townspeople freedom from labor obligations and freedom to travel at will. Charters protected town wealth from unreasonable taxation and seizure. Some charters allowed towns to operate their own law courts, and in return, lords received money, especially from prosperous burghs. Those who wished to escape the feudal lord's tentacles found refuge in towns. And if a peasant could live for a year and a day without being caught, freedom was granted, and the peasant could stay in the town. When townspeople could not obtain their desired liberties, they organized into sworn associations called communes. This is where the term communism comes from. Communes, community. Oftentimes, they staged violent revolutions to guarantee rights connected to urban life. Communes elected their own officials. They regulated taxation within the town, and they conducted urban center functions. Now, it was anti-democratic in nature because it came from the notion that the rich had the natural right to govern in the towns. And the experiences of the communes were diverse. Italy's communes strengthened over time, developing into independent city-states. French and English towns remained subject to the authority of the king. Yet towns encouraged people to develop skills, learn a trade, and make money. And those who learned a trade from organizations to protect their interests, let me try this again here. Those who learned a trade formed organizations to protect their interests. Guilds arose in towns to control trade, to control manufacturing within its boundaries. Guilds regulated product quality. They managed membership and they set prices. So goldsmiths, carpenters, blacksmiths, bakers, tailors, and others participated in guilds. And they arranged marriages to cement bonds of loyalty and control of commerce. And they enlisted apprentices in their shops until the apprentices learned their trade. Once fulfilling their role as apprentice, an apprentice became a journeyman, a paid employee under the guidance of a master. And in order for a journeyman to qualify as guild masters themselves, they had to successfully present a sample of their best work, known as a masterpiece, to a guild master. In this way, the guild controlled the quality of the products and membership. So in essence, guilds were professional associations in which usually only master artisans were allowed to be members. Guilds promoted their members and tried to limit competition while ensuring high quality and expert craftsmanship. And the guilds helped regulate the market by ensuring certain fields were not flooded by an excess of workers, and they kept demand slightly higher than supply. Guilds prohibited after-hours work, and they secured safe work environments for their members and their apprentices. They also served a social function and often had religious ties and served members in times of personal or local difficulty. Now, the dependents of a master craftsman were supported by the guild after his death. And guilds were also for merchants and even physicians, and often became powerful players in local government. They decided on local administrative issues, they elected representatives, and they even decided issues of citizenship and other matters. So we've heard the term bourgeoisie. This is a term to identify a town's upper middle class: doctors, lawyers, royal and clerical office holders, merchants. They lived in a walled settlement meant to protect life and property. And this walled or protective settlement was called a burg, or a burg, that housed educated and status-conscious people. And since Roman times, towns contained significant populations of Jews, and they played vital roles in towns. They were merchants, artisans, and held other professions. But over time, Christian merchants and craftspeople viewed the Jewish community as competitive, and slowly they began to exclude them from guilds and prevented them from owning land. Ultimately, Jews were segregated from the Christian majority in neighborhoods known as ghettos. Now, as the Middle Ages progressed, so did the power of the church. And as part of the feudal system, the church likewise acquired land through feudal exchange. Many church officials were nobles, fighting as vassals in the system. Plus, the church received donations of lands from those concerned about their fate in the afterlife. And gradually, the church became one of the largest landowners in Europe, with a very powerful voice in politics. And this power spawned reform efforts. The first major reform started with the monastery at Cluny, where the clergy called for the church to be free from the feudal system. And in 1059, cardinals began to choose the pope rather than kings or mobs. And later in 1073, Pope Gregory VII criticized and fought the German Holy Roman Emperor over the practice in which kings and other secular nobles appointed church officials to positions such as cardinal or bishop in their respective kingdoms. This challenge was known as lay investiture, and the investiture controversy weakened the authority of the emperor. And in addition, the church started in earnest to challenge the denial of basic church teachings, known as heresy. Crusades were mounted against those found guilty. But two young priests, an Italian and a Spaniard, sought a different approach. St. Francis of Assisi devoted his life to poverty and total service to his congregation. St. Dominic converted heretics back to the faith through intellectual disputation and preaching. And to combat heresies, the church created an institution known as the Inquisition. It's a clerical court that brought individuals suspected of adhering to forbidden doctrines before a panel of Dominican friars who questioned their beliefs. Taken to its severest form, the Spanish, in its 300-year reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula against Islamic rule, used the Inquisition through brutal methods to extract confessions, render malcontents, and publicly burn recalcitrants. It became an effective tool designed to undermine Native American and African rebellions in Spanish colonial adventures 100 years later. Yet the church inspired people visually with architecture, and two types developed in the Middle Ages. The first was Romanesque, which was very similar to Roman architecture, which included thick walls, small windows with rounded arches, and barrel vaults. And by the mid-11th century emerged the Gothic style. Churches were considered to be a representation of prayer in stone and glass. And along with stained glass windows, Gothic architecture featured flying buttresses that held up thin walls, pointed arches, and ribbed vaults. And with the economic boom and the rise of the bourgeoisie in towns, education became the central focus for economic mobility. Guilds of teachers in a central location created the first European centers of higher learning. As they developed into universities, they were infused from forgotten sources of knowledge that poured in from the Crusades and Spain's Reconquista. And the majority of the sources preserved by Muslim scholars were writings of Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle. Many educators tried to apply and reconcile Aristotle's philosophy to Christian theological questions. And two important scholars from the University of Paris led a movement known as scholasticism. Peter Abelard, who wrote Sic et Non, Yes or No, and Thomas Aquinas, who wrote Summa Theologica, or Summary of Religious Thought, were new ways by which to view the world. Literature also flourished. And throughout the Middle Ages, traveling poet musicians known as troubadours sang about heroic people and their deeds. And the French developed these epic songs into a literary form that celebrated courage and codes of chivalry. And most often, serious writing between educated people was conducted in Latin. And by the 14th century, literature started to be written in the everyday language of the people, known as the vernacular. And the most famous of these early vernacular literary texts were the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, and Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. Now, with the disintegration of the Roman Empire, a political void was created in Europe, and three kingdoms arose to dominate the partisan landscape of the continent, eventually becoming the modern-day countries of England, France, and Germany. In 1066, William the Bastard of Normandy organized an army from a region of France called Normandy and defeated Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who were united as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms at the Battle of Hastings. And after conquering England, he became known as William the Conqueror. He centralized power of the monarch and in 1068 undertook the first census of England for taxation purposes, detailed in the Domesday Book. And King Henry II established the traditional use of common law and jury trials. But nobles reacted, and in 1215 forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, which limited royal power and gave nobles governance powers. And in 1295, King Edward I created the model parliament that was made up of people from the clergy, nobility, and the merchant class to advise the king. In France, centralization of power took much longer. King Philip II and King Louis IX overpowered the feudal system and made royal courts dominant over feudal courts. However, when King Philip IV, between 1285 and 1314, needed to raise taxes, the nobility refused to support an assembly until an assembly of nobles, clergy, and merchants checked the power of the monarchy. The result was the creation of the Estates General. And in the region of Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire, King Otto centralized power, yet the relationship with the Pope was rife with conflict. And not until 1122 did the Pope and Germany reach a compromise over the policy of lay investiture at the Concordat of Worms. The centralization of the monarchy in Germany was tempered by the assertion of papal authority. Now, as France and England developed into centralized state authorities, feudal disputes over lands in northwestern France and English claims on the throne of France led to war. And between 1137 and 1453, the 100 Years' War devastated continental Europe. The English dominated the French for the majority of the war, defeating the French in the Battle of Crécy in 1346 and the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. When a 17-year-old peasant girl named Joan of Arc emerged on the political and military scene, the French lifted the siege of Orleans and crowned Charles VII as King of France at the traditional site of Reims. Joan of Arc was betrayed by Charles VII. She was captured and executed as a witch by the English. Her death became a rallying point, and her memory encouraged French forces to oust the British in 1453. And from this war, the French developed a sense of unity. Feudalism was adversely affected and continued to decline, and the war itself caused devastation and chaos for the continent. Trade and agriculture were hampered for 100 years, and this affected the growth of medieval culture. England, with defeat, plunged into a civil war called the War of the Roses that lasted 30 years, from 1455 to 1485. It was a dynastic struggle between the Yorks and the Lancasters, and as they exhausted themselves, it allowed a Tudor to ascend the throne. Two events in church political history also took place in medieval culture, or tore medieval culture apart. And that was known as the Babylonian captivity and the Great Schism. Now, the Babylonian captivity, which lasted over 70 years, started in 1305 when Pope Clement V, under the influence of the French king, moved the papal court from its traditional home of Rome to Avignon, France, where it remained until 1377. And many viewed the French monarch as having too much influence on the Pope. And the popes elected during the captivity were always French, and their interests were well represented. When the Pope died in 1378, a Roman mob forced the College of Cardinals to elect an Italian pope who would return the papal court to Rome. And upon the court's return to Rome under Urban VI, the Great Schism began, which lasted from 1378 to 1414, and it deepened when the College of Cardinals declared their election of the Italian pope invalid and elected a French pope named Clement VII, who then moved the papal court back to Avignon. Both popes claimed to be legitimate popes, denouncing each other as impostors. The schism hastened the calling of a universal conclave of bishops known as the Conciliar movement. And to the movement, the church community, not the Pope, had supreme powers of doctrinal definition. And the ideas expressed led to the revolt of 1381, led by John Wycliffe in England. And these rebels were called the Wycliffites or Lollards, and their ideas about ordinary people interpreting scripture for themselves spread throughout Europe. Curiously, in 1409, the Council of Pisa tried to eliminate the problem. They tried to unite the church, and they elected another pope. Now there were 3 popes, all of them claiming legitimacy. And finally, a bigger and more representative council convened, forcing all 3 popes to resign and electing Pope Martin V to rule. And his court was sent to Rome, ending the Great Schism. It was known as the Council of Constance, and it condemned the Wycliffites as heretics. However, the council paid lip service to reforming the church and the clergy, and this forever tarnished the church's authority over political and spiritual matters. And the needs for basic reform were ignored until the situation erupted with Martin Luther. Now comes the nasty. In this time of spiritual and political turmoil arrived one of the most nasty experiences, the most vicious, the most violent episodes of bubonic plague that was ever visited upon a people. It was carried by flea-infested rats. The Black Death arrived in the caravans that traveled the trade routes of Central Asia, where it originated. Tartar armies besieging the black seaport of Kaffa contracted the disease. It was then brought to Europe when merchant ships housing the infected rats fled Kaffa to Italian ports. The disease spread like wildfire, devastating France, England, and Spain by 1348. And by 1349, Russia, Scandinavia, and Germany were infected. It is estimated that at least 1/3 of the population of Europe, approximately 25 million people, died. And there were psychic consequences. Art reflected a fascination with death. The Grim Reaper became a reminder of human mortality. The waiting Last Judgment figured prominently in pictorial and sculptural art. The Dance of Death pictured skeletons linking arms with living revelers. Sinners were punished for their immoral conduct. Flagellations became common as sinners beat sin from their flesh. Jewish minorities were blamed as punishment for Christians allowing them to live among them. Many Jewish communities were publicly burned at the stake. Christianity took on the conscience of sin and its consequences. So this concludes the second part of Europe's Middle Ages. Many changes between 1300 to the late 1500s occurred in Europe that would have drastic consequences for the system known as feudalism. So first, we covered Islam's takeover of the Middle East and the church's attempt to take it back, the odyssey known as the Crusades. Next, we appreciated the financial revolution that was occurring in towns, especially in Italy, that caused the rise of the guild system for labor and merchants. Subsequently, we appreciated the 100 Years' War. It was a seesaw fight between the French and British, fought on French land. And following the war, we surveyed reorganizational movements within the church that eventually helped usher in the Protestant Reformation. Please view a small film clip that helps us appreciate and puts within context that transformation. Because finally, the Black Death tour devastated society.